Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most consequential geopolitical relationships of our time, the rivalry between the United States and China. But this isn't just about recent trade wars or military tensions in the South China Sea. To understand how we got here, we need to go back decades, even centuries, to trace the complex historical roots of this relationship. Chapter 1. The Early Encounters. The relationship between America and China began long before either was a global superpower. In 1784, just 8 years after American independence, the merchant ship Empress of China sailed from New York to Canton, marking the beginning of American trade with China. This wasn't a relationship between equals. China was the dominant power, controlling trade through the restrictive Canton system, while America was a young nation eager for Asian markets. The early American approach to China was largely shaped by missionaries and merchants. American missionaries arrived in China in the early 1800s, believing they could convert the world's most populous nation to Christianity. Meanwhile, American traders sought profits from Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. This dual mission of commerce and Christianity would influence American attitudes toward China for generations. The First Opium War between Britain and China from 1839 to 1842 marked a turning point. While America wasn't directly involved in the conflict, it benefited from the Treaty of Nanking, which opened Chinese ports to foreign trade. The U.S. quickly negotiated its own Treaty of Wanghia in 1844, gaining similar trading privileges and extraterritorial rights. This period established several patterns that would persist. China viewed these treaties as unequal treaties imposed by foreign powers, while Americans saw them as opening China to beneficial Western influence. The seeds of mutual misunderstanding were already being planted. The late 19th century saw America's growing involvement in Chinese affairs. When European powers began carving China into spheres of influence after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95, the U.S. feared being excluded from Chinese markets. Secretary of State John Hay's open-door notes of 1899 and 1900 called for equal commercial access to China and respect for Chinese territorial integrity. While presented as protecting China's sovereignty, the open-door policy was primarily about ensuring American economic interests. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 further complicated the relationship. When Chinese nationalists attacked foreign legations in Beijing, an international force, including American troops, intervened to rescue the diplomats. The U.S. used its share of the Boxer indemnity to fund Chinese students studying in America, a gesture that created some goodwill but also reinforced the paternalistic nature of the relationship. Throughout this period, American attitudes toward China were contradictory. Americans admired Chinese civilization and culture while simultaneously viewing China as backward and in need of Western modernization. This paternalistic attitude, the belief that America knew what was best for China, would become a recurring source of tension. Chapter 2. World War II and the Seeds of Alliance. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 fundamentally altered the U.S.-China relationship. As Japan's aggression escalated, Americans increasingly sympathized with Chinese resistance. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 made China and America formal allies against Japan. During World War II, China was portrayed in American media and government propaganda as a democratic ally fighting for freedom against fascist aggression. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Sung Mei-ling, became celebrities in America. Sung Mei-ling's 1943 address to Congress was met with thunderous applause, and she graced the cover of Time magazine multiple times. However, this wartime alliance masked fundamental disagreements. American officials in China, including General Joseph Stilwell, reported that Chiang's nationalist government was corrupt, ineffective, and more interested in fighting Chinese communists than Japanese invaders. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong in their Yan'an base, appeared more dedicated to fighting the Japanese and more responsive to the needs of ordinary Chinese. The U.S. faced a dilemma. Should it continue supporting Chiang's nationalists as the legitimate government of China, or should it work with the communists who seemed more effective at fighting Japan? This question became more pressing as it became clear that civil war between the nationalists and communists was inevitable once Japan was defeated. American attempts to mediate between the nationalists and communists, most notably through General George Marshall's mission from 1945 to 1947, failed spectacularly. Both sides used ceasefires to reposition their forces, and neither was genuinely committed to a coalition government. The Marshall Mission's failure marked the end of American hopes for a unified, democratic China aligned with U.S. interests. As the Chinese Civil War intensified, American policymakers faced criticism for losing China. Conservative politicians and media figures accused the Truman administration of insufficient support for Chiang Kai-shek. However, by 1948, it was clear that the nationalists were losing despite massive American aid. Military advisors reported that additional aid would only delay the inevitable while potentially drawing America into direct military intervention. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, it marked not just the end of the Chinese Civil War, but the beginning of a new phase in U.S.-China relations. The world's most powerful capitalist democracy now faced the world's most populous communist state. Chapter 3. The Cold War Confrontation. The establishment of the People's Republic of China coincided with the height of the Cold War, immediately placing U.S.-China relations within the broader context of the global struggle between capitalism and communism. The U.S. refused to recognize the new government, instead maintaining diplomatic relations with Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan. Mao Zedong's famous declaration that China would lean to one side in the Cold War meant aligning with the Soviet Union against the United States. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, signed in February 1950, formalized this alignment. From the American perspective, this created a monolithic communist bloc stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 marked the first direct military confrontation between American and Chinese forces. When UN forces led by General Douglas MacArthur approached the Chinese border, China warned that it would intervene. The Americans dismissed these warnings as bluffs. In November 1950, Chinese People's Volunteer Army forces crossed into Korea, catching American forces off guard and dramatically altering the course of the war. The Korean War had profound implications for U.S.-China relations. For Americans, Chinese intervention proved that Communist China was an aggressive expansionist power willing to attack American forces. For Chinese, American forces approaching their border confirmed their fears of American encirclement and aggression. The war resulted in heavy casualties on both sides and solidified mutual hostility for decades. The 1950s saw the institutionalization of containment toward China. The U.S. established a network of military alliances in Asia, including treaties with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. American naval forces patrolled the Taiwan Strait, and economic embargoes restricted trade with China. China responded by deepening its alliance with the Soviet Union and supporting communist movements throughout Asia. The Taiwan Strait crises of 1954 to 55 and 1958 brought the two nations to the brink of nuclear war. When China shelled Taiwanese-controlled islands near the mainland coast, the U.S. threatened nuclear retaliation. These crises established a pattern of brinksmanship that characterized the relationship for decades. Interestingly, even during the height of confrontation, both sides occasionally sought dialogue. The Geneva Conference of 1954 and subsequent ambassadorial talks in Geneva and Warsaw created channels for communication. However, these talks produced few concrete results, as both sides were constrained by domestic political pressures and ideological rigidity. The Vietnam War further complicated U.S.-China relations. While China provided substantial military aid to North Vietnam, it was careful not to intervene directly, as it had in Korea. Chinese leaders feared that direct confrontation with the U.S. in Vietnam could escalate to nuclear war, while Americans worried that attacking Chinese supply lines could trigger Chinese intervention. By the late 1960s, however, the foundation for a dramatic shift in U.S.-China relations was being laid, though few realized it at the time. Chapter 4. The Great Rapprochement. The transformation of U.S.-China relations from bitter enemies to strategic partners represents one of the most dramatic diplomatic reversals in modern history. This shift was driven by changing geopolitical realities, particularly the Sino-Soviet split and the strategic vision of leaders like Nixon, Kissinger, and Mao Zedong. The Sino-Soviet split, which became public in the early 1960s, fundamentally altered Cold War dynamics. What Americans had perceived as a monolithic communist bloc was actually fracturing along national and ideological lines. By the late 1960s, China and the Soviet Union were engaged in border clashes that threatened to escalate into full-scale war. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger recognized that the Sino-Soviet split created an opportunity to improve relations with China. In a multipolar world, America could benefit from closer ties with China to balance Soviet power. This strategic triangulation became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The secret diplomacy that led to Nixon's 1972 visit to China began with subtle signals. In his 1969 inaugural address, Nixon referred to the People's Republic of China rather than Communist China, a small but significant shift in rhetoric. More concrete signals came through intermediaries, particularly Pakistani President Yahya Khan, who served as a secret channel between Washington and Beijing. The breakthrough came in April 1971, when China invited the American ping pong team to visit, an event that became known as ping pong diplomacy. This seemingly innocuous sports exchange opened the door for more serious diplomatic contact. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing in July 1971 stunned the world and paved the way for Nixon's historic trip. Nixon's visit to China in February 1972 was a masterpiece of diplomatic theater. The images of Nixon walking on the Great Wall and toasting with Mao Zedong symbolized the dramatic transformation in relations. The Shanghai Communiqué, issued at the end of the visit, established the framework for future relations while acknowledging continuing disagreements, particularly over Taiwan. The rapprochement had profound implications for both countries. For China, it ended international isolation and provided a counterweight to Soviet pressure. For America, it offered leverage against the Soviet Union and potential access to the world's largest consumer market. The timing was crucial. China was emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and beginning to consider economic reforms, while America was seeking ways to extract itself from Vietnam and manage Soviet power. The process of normalization continued under Presidents Ford and Carter. Jimmy Carter completed the process by establishing full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China on January 1, 1979, while simultaneously ending official relations with Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act, passed by Congress later that year, maintained unofficial ties with Taiwan and committed the U.S. to provide defensive arms, creating an ambiguous but workable arrangement. Chapter 5. Cooperation and Growing Tensions. The establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979 ushered in a period of unprecedented cooperation between the United States and China. This honeymoon period was driven by shared strategic interests, particularly the desire to contain Soviet expansionism and China's embrace of economic reform under Deng Xiaoping. The strategic partnership reached its peak in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. Despite Reagan's strong anti-communist rhetoric and his initial sympathy for Taiwan, his administration deepened military and intelligence cooperation with China. The two countries collaborated in supporting the Afghan Mujahideen against Soviet occupation, providing weapons to rebels in Cambodia fighting the Vietnamese-backed government, and sharing intelligence on Soviet military activities. Economically, China's reform and opening up policy created new opportunities for American businesses. U.S. companies invested in Chinese manufacturing, taking advantage of low labor costs and China's vast market potential. Two-way trade grew from virtually nothing to billions of dollars annually. American universities welcomed Chinese students, and cultural exchanges flourished. However, even during this period of cooperation, underlying tensions persisted. The fundamental differences in political systems meant that human rights remained a contentious issue. American critics argued that the U.S. was prioritizing strategic interests over democratic values by cooperating with an authoritarian regime. The relationship faced its first major crisis since rapprochement, when student-led pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in Beijing's Tiananmen Square in spring 1989. The movement, which called for political reform and an end to corruption, captured international attention and sympathy. American media coverage portrayed the students as Chinese versions of American revolutionaries, fighting for democracy and freedom. The Chinese government's violent crackdown on June 4, 1989, shocked Americans and fundamentally altered perceptions of China. Images of tanks rolling through Beijing streets and the famous Tank Man photograph became symbols of Chinese authoritarianism. President George H.W. Bush faced enormous pressure to impose comprehensive sanctions on China. The Tiananmen Square incident marked a turning point in U.S.-China relations. The strategic partnership that had defined the 1980s gave way to a more complex relationship characterized by cooperation in some areas and competition in others. The end of the Cold War removed the shared Soviet threat that had united the two countries, forcing them to redefine their relationship. Chapter 6: Economic Partnership and Strategic Drift. The period following Tiananmen Square saw U.S.-China relations enter a new phase characterized by growing economic interdependence alongside increasing strategic competition. The end of the Cold War eliminated the shared Soviet threat that had previously united the two countries, forcing both to reconsider their relationship's foundations. Despite initial sanctions and diplomatic tensions following Tiananmen, economic incentives gradually overcame political obstacles. Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour reinvigorated China's economic reforms, creating new opportunities for American businesses. The Clinton administration, despite campaigning on human rights concerns, gradually shifted toward constructive engagement, believing that economic integration would promote political liberalization in China. The debate over China's most favored nation, MFN, trade status became an annual ritual during the 1990s. Critics argued that trade privileges should be conditional on human rights improvements, while business interests and strategic thinkers contended that engagement was more likely to promote positive change than isolation. By 1994, Clinton administration delinked trade from human rights, prioritizing economic relations. China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 represented the high point of economic integration. The U.S. strongly supported Chinese membership, believing that WTO rules would force China to liberalize its economy and eventually its political system. The decision reflected the prevailing assumption that economic development would naturally lead to democratization. However, this period also saw the emergence of strategic tensions that would later define the rivalry. The 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis demonstrated that fundamental disagreements over Taiwan remained unresolved. When China conducted missile tests near Taiwan during its first democratic presidential election, the U.S. deployed 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the area, leading to the most serious military confrontation since the 1970s. The accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the 1999 Kosovo War sparked massive anti-American protests in China and severely strained relations. While the U.S. maintained the bombing was accidental, many Chinese believed it was intentional, reflecting deeper suspicions about American intentions. The 2001 EP-3 incident, where a Chinese fighter jet collided with a U.S. surveillance aircraft, further highlighted growing military tensions. The 11-day standoff over the detained American crew demonstrated how quickly incidents could escalate into diplomatic crises. During this period, China's rapid economic growth began to alter the global balance of power. GDP growth averaged nearly 10% annually, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, but also creating new capabilities and ambitions. Chinese leaders spoke of peaceful development and China's peaceful rise, attempting to reassure neighbors and the U.S. that growing Chinese power would not threaten international stability. American responses to China's rise varied. Some, like Robert Zoellick, called for making China a responsible stakeholder in the international system, encouraging Chinese integration into global institutions and norms. Others, particularly in military and intelligence communities, worried about China's growing capabilities and long-term intentions. The 2008 global financial crisis marked another inflection point. China's economy weathered the crisis better than most, leading to increased confidence in the China model of state-directed capitalism. Meanwhile, the crisis exposed weaknesses in the American economic system, leading some Chinese leaders to question whether the U.S. was in irreversible decline. Chapter 7: The Pivot to Competition. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia policy marked a significant shift in American strategy toward China. While couched in terms of general regional engagement, the pivot was widely understood as a response to China's growing power and assertiveness. Several factors drove this strategic shift. China's handling of the 2008 financial crisis had increased its confidence and willingness to challenge American leadership. Chinese military modernization was accelerating, with particular focus on capabilities designed to deny American military access to the Western Pacific. Most concerning to American strategists was China's increasingly assertive behavior in maritime disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea. The Obama administration's approach combined engagement with hedging strategies. Diplomatically, the U.S. sought to integrate China into international institutions while encouraging responsible behavior. Economically, efforts like the Trans-Pacific Partnership aimed to create high-standard trade rules that would either force China to reform or exclude it from regional economic integration. Militarily, the U.S. began rotating forces to Australia, strengthening alliances with Japan and South Korea, and increasing military cooperation with Southeast Asian nations. China's response was to accelerate its own strategic initiatives. The announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 represented China's most ambitious foreign policy project since opening to the world. This massive infrastructure program aimed to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through Chinese-financed projects, potentially creating a Sino-centric economic network. In the South China Sea, China's island-building activities and declaration of an air defense identification zone over disputed areas in the East China Sea directly challenged American interests and those of U.S. allies. The U.S. responded with freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships near Chinese-controlled features to challenge what it viewed as excessive maritime claims. Cybersecurity emerged as a new domain of competition. High-profile cyber attacks on American companies and government agencies, many traced to China, led to increased tensions. The 2015 agreement between Obama and Xi Jinping to refrain from commercial cyber espionage represented an attempt to establish rules for this new domain of competition. Economic tensions also intensified during this period. China's exchange rate policies, restrictions on foreign investment, and allegations of technology transfer requirements became sources of friction. American businesses that had initially welcomed China's WTO membership increasingly complained about unfair competition and market access restrictions. The rise of Xi Jinping as Chinese leader in 2012 to 2013 coincided with more assertive Chinese foreign policy. Xi's consolidation of power, emphasis on the China dream of national rejuvenation, and willingness to challenge the international order signaled a more confident and potentially confrontational China. By the end of Obama's presidency, the foundations for strategic competition were firmly in place. While both sides continued to emphasize cooperation on global challenges like climate change, the underlying trajectory was toward rivalry rather than partnership. Chapter 8: The New Cold War. The Trump administration's approach to China marked a decisive break from decades of engagement policy. The 2017 National Security Strategy explicitly identified China as a strategic competitor and revisionist power seeking to challenge American leadership and the liberal international order. The trade war that began in 2018 represented the most significant economic confrontation between the two countries since the 1970s. What started as disputes over trade deficits and market access evolved into a broader technological and economic competition. Tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in goods, restrictions on technology transfers, and bans on Chinese technology companies reflected a fundamental shift in how both countries viewed their relationship. The concept of strategic competition replaced the previous framework of cooperation and competition. This shift was bipartisan, with Democrats and Republicans agreeing that the previous engagement policy had failed to transform China in desired directions. Instead, China had used the benefits of integration to strengthen its authoritarian system and challenge American interests. Several factors drove this transformation. China's continued economic growth had made it a peer competitor to the United States in many areas. Military modernization programs had created new capabilities that threatened American military dominance in the Western Pacific. Most importantly, under Xi Jinping's leadership, China had become more willing to challenge international norms and institutions rather than simply integrate into the existing order. Understanding the rivalry. So how did we get here? How did two countries that were allies in World War II, partners in confronting Soviet power, and economic collaborators become strategic rivals? The answer lies in the intersection of several historical factors. First, the structural dynamics of international relations suggest that tensions between a rising power and an established hegemon are common, though not inevitable. China's rapid rise has altered the global balance of power, creating natural points of friction with the United States. Second, ideological differences that were temporarily set aside for strategic reasons have reasserted themselves. The belief that economic development would lead to political liberalization in China has proven incorrect, leaving fundamental disagreements about governance and human rights unresolved. Third, both countries have developed different visions of international order. The United States supports a liberal international system based on democratic values, market economics, and multilateral institutions. China advocates for a more multipolar world where different political systems coexist and sovereignty is more strictly respected. Fourth, domestic political factors in both countries have contributed to the rivalry. In the United States, concerns about job losses, trade deficits, and technological competition have created pressure for tougher policies toward China. In China, growing nationalism and confidence in the China model have reduced interest in conforming to Western expectations. Finally, mutual misunderstanding and miscommunication have exacerbated tensions. Each country tends to interpret the other's actions through the lens of its own values and experiences, leading to misperceptions about intentions and motivations. It's important to note that this rivalry is not inevitable or necessarily permanent. History shows that relationships between major powers can change dramatically based on leadership, circumstances, and strategic choices. The U.S.-China relationship has already undergone several major transformations, from hostility to partnership to competition. The current era of strategic competition presents both dangers and opportunities. The risk of miscalculation leading to military conflict, economic decoupling that reduces global prosperity, and ideological confrontation that undermines international cooperation are all real. However, competition can also drive innovation, force both countries to improve their systems, and potentially lead to new forms of cooperation on shared challenges. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone trying to make sense of current U.S.-China relations. The rivalry didn't emerge overnight, and it won't be resolved quickly. It reflects deep structural, ideological, and cultural differences that will likely persist for decades to come. As we look to the future, the key question is not whether the United States and China will compete. They will, but whether they can manage that competition responsibly. The historical precedents offer both cautionary tales of great power rivalries that led to war and encouraging examples of competition that remained within peaceful bounds. The story of U.S.-China relations reminds us that international relationships are complex, dynamic, and shaped by historical forces that extend far beyond the intentions of individual leaders. By understanding this history, we can better appreciate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in one of the most consequential relationships of our time. What do you think about this historical journey we've taken today? Do you see patterns or lessons that might help predict where U.S.-China relations are headed? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the historical roots of contemporary geopolitics.